Hello everyone, I am Bowser Jr. XD, and welcome back to another video. In the last episode of this series, we were introduced to the basics of IndyCar and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and saw some of the greatest races in IndyCar history. Of course, as we go on, we'll also see more of the weirder moments, like say, a driver getting fired before even starting a race, or a goddamn mannequin falling onto the track. So sit back and relax as we progress to Iceberg Tier 2. Tom Carnegie was the announcer for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway from 1946 to 2006, and his instantly recognizable voice earned him the moniker Voice of the Speedway. Even if you haven't heard of him, you've definitely heard him, especially if you've heard the phrase,
"And it's a new track record."
Sid Collins was the radio announcer for the Indy 500 from 1953 to 1976, also making him the first lead for the IMS radio network. His commentary became one of the landmarks of Indy 500 coverage, given that the Indy 500 was not broadcast live until 1986. Unfortunately, in 1975, Collins would be diagnosed with ALS, and he would tragically take his own life in 1976. Jim Nabors was an actor most famous for playing the role of Gomer Pyle. However, in the minds of IndyCar fans, he's most famous for singing Back Home Again in Indiana as part of the Indy 500 pre-race ceremonies from 1972 to 2014, give or take a few years. Following his death, Back Home Again in Indiana has stayed a part of the race's traditions.
How I long for my Indiana home.
Paul Newman, like Jim Nabors, was an actor, but unlike Nabors, Newman had a more active role in the IndyCar series. He, along with Carl Haas, started the legendary Newman-Haas racing team in 1983. Mario Andretti would score the team's first win that year at Road America, and go on to get the team's first title in 1984. Over the next few decades, the team would amass a total of 107 wins, with an additional 7 championships between Michael Andretti, Nigel Mansell, Cristiano D'Amato, and Sebastian Bourdais. Following the reunification of IndyCar in 2008, Justin Wilson would score the team's final victory at Detroit, with Paul Newman passing away just a month later. Andy Granatelli was the CEO of the STP Corporation, and while the company is much more well known for its presence in NASCAR, the company had an equal presence in IndyCar from the 60s to the 80s. Granatelli's presence was most visible in the late 60s and early 70s, as he would actually enter his own cars in races, including one you'll see later on. Under the banner of the STP Corporation, Granatelli would score 14 wins from 1968 to 1972. His crowning moment came in 1969, when Mario Andretti would win the Indy 500 in a backup car for Granatelli's team, delivering Granatelli his only Indy 500 win as an owner. Granatelli would go back to just sponsoring cars in 1973, with his legacy living on through Patrick Racing and 2 more Indy 500 wins. Racing families are prevalent in every single form of motorsports, and IndyCar is no different. Most of the families saw their legacies blossom in the 80s and 90s, including the Andrettis, the Unsers, the Bettenhausens, the Foyts, and the Villeneuves. Modern examples include Connor Daly, son of F1 driver Derek Daly, and the young Sebastian Weldon, son of the legendary Dan Weldon. George Benyati was a legendary mechanic from the 60s and 70s. His cars won 85 races, including an impressive 7 Indy 500s, 1961, 1964, 1966, 1970, 1971, 1973, and 1983. The first of his 500s came as an owner of Benyati Bose Racing, which won 14 races between 1958 to 1962 with A.J. Foyt at the wheel. The last of these Indy 500s came as an owner of Benyati Carter Racing, which would win 6 races from 1981 to 1983 with Tom Sneva at the wheel. Harry Miller was yet another legendary mechanic, this time from the 1920s and 1930s. Back in the Roaring Twenties, Miller was so far ahead of his time as a mechanic that from 1923 to 1928, cars that he built made up a whopping 5/6 of the field. His cars won a staggering 87 races, with his engines and other cars taking another 24. This includes a whopping 12 Indy 500 victories in 1922, 1923, 1926, 1928, 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, 1934, 1936, and 1938. His shop foreman would continue as the developer of the legendary Offenhauser engine, which won an incredible 322 wins between 1935 and 1976, including the Miller chassis' final victory at the New York State Fairgrounds in 1936. Steve Olvey is a doctor on the FIA Medical Commission, but his prominent role in IndyCar was that as the medical director for CART in its lifespan from 1979 to 2003. His most famous moments were unfortunately tragedies, as part of the response team for the deaths of Gordon Smiley in 1982 and Greg Moore in 1999. Carl Fisher was the architect of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. In 1908, Fisher would buy over 300 acres of land in Indianapolis as a site for the Speedway. The original plan was to build a 3-mile superspeedway, but space limitations led to the current 2.5-mile layout. Following IMS's completion, Fisher would go on to own the Speedway from 1909 to 1927. Dick Wallen was a photographer and videographer known for his coverage of open-wheel racing in the mid-1900s. He began with books on sprint car racing featuring his pictures lasting through the 40s and 50s, but starting in 1958, he began to produce videos. He began to sell his highlights in 1983, which increased his fame and led to a segment on ESPN Speed Week where he would showcase the days of old. The memories of sprint car racing in the 60s and 70s live on through Dick Wallen's racing classics. Eddie Rickenbacker was the US's best pilot for World War I. What you might not know is he was also an IndyCar driver, having won 3 IndyCar races at Sheepshead Bay Raceway, Pacific Coast Speedway, and Morris Park in 1916. He would go on to become the second owner of IMS from 1927 to 1945. The Roadster refers to the style of car popularized in IndyCar in the 50s and 60s. The sleek, cylindrical, and occasionally flat models roared across the yard of brick in those days, and even though they became obsolete, they remain a beloved part of IndyCar history. The Andretti curse is a long-standing superstition dating back to the 1969 Indy 500. When Mario Andretti went to victory lane, Andy Granatelli was so ecstatic that he kissed Mario. Since then, despite 3 generations of Andrettis attempting for the next 5 decades, the Andretti name never again took the checkered flag in the greatest spectacle of racing. In 1985, while racing Mario Andretti for the win in the Indy 500, Danny Sullivan would spin in turn 1 with 81 laps to go. Miraculously, Sullivan would get the car going again after a full 360-degree turn and hold on to second place. Even more incredibly, Sullivan would track down Andretti 20 laps later and pass him, holding on to take the victory. This would complete the spin and win.
The new American hero is Daniel John Sullivan III of Louisville, Kentucky, who has won the Indianapolis 500.
The pass was completed at Laguna Seca in 1996. Entering the final lap, Brian Herta had a small lead on Alex Zanardi. However, entering the corkscrew, Zanardi would floor it and attempt a bonsai move straight across the curves. The move was successful, securing Zanardi the win and the pass a place in history. The musical theme for the Chuck Norris movie Delta Force was used as the intro for the Indy 500 from 1988 to 1998 and again in 2001. It does make for a good hype song. The Indy 500 was used as a round for the Formula One schedule from 1950 to 1960. However, most teams would skip it in favor of running at Monaco. As such, Indianapolis would depart from the calendar in favor of Watkins Glen. The track would not return to F1 until 2000. 24 ten-thousandths of a second is the smallest margin of victory in IndyCar history. This happened in 2002 at the Delphi Indy 300 at Chicagoland Speedway, with Sam Hornish Jr. beating Al Unser Jr.
Now Buddy Lazier comes up to take a look to the inside. And Unser Jr. and Hornish go to the line side by side. Unofficially, it's Hornish who takes the win.
The 1984 Indy 500 saw a whopping 117 entries sign up for the Indy 500, marking the most entrants in the race's history. Only 87 teams would actually make it to the garage, which was also an IndyCar record. The 1981 Indy 500 featured the most controversy in the race up to that point. Following a caution on lap 146, both Mario Andretti and Bobby Unser would go into pit. The rules stated that the driver must blend into traffic upon exiting pit road. Andretti would blend in as soon as possible, passing 2 cars in the process. Unser, on the other hand, who interpreted the apron of turn 1 and 2 as an extension of pit road, would pass 14 cars before blending back in. USAC somehow missed this, and the race continued as normal. Unser would win, but Andretti, who came in second, would unsurprisingly protest the finish. This would initially reverse the outcome, but after Penske and Unser appealed that decision, Unser would be given back the win a few months later. And then, of course, we have the 2002 Indy 500, the other most controversial Indy 500. With 2 laps to go and coming to the white flag, Paul Tracy began to pass Helio Castroneves. At the same time, Laurent Redon crashed, causing the race to go to yellow. While Paul Tracy believed he was ahead at the time of caution, race control, led by the infamous Brian Barnhart, declared Castroneves as the winner. Tracy and Team Green would dispute, indicating that they were ahead of Castroneves when the caution came out. Race control would conclude that Castroneves was ahead when the caution button was hit, as well as the fact that race control had audibly said that Castroneves had won. This call may also have come from favoritism, as Castroneves was an IndyCar driver driving for an IndyCar team, while Tracy was a kart driver for a kart team. After a 1994 season where Team Penske had absolutely dominated, winning 12 of 16 races and winning the Indy 500 with a controversial Mercedes engine, new rule changes were put in place to limit the engines, thus neutering the Mercedes. Penske was unable to overcome the rule changes, ultimately resulting in both Al Unser Jr. and Emerson Fittipaldi failing to qualify for the Indy 500, marking the only time that Penske had ever failed to qualify for the event when attempting it.
He has to beat 224.9. 224.907, he can't do it. He doesn't do it. Al Unser Jr. has not yet qualified.
In 2012, in the midst of introducing a new chassis, a new engine manufacturer jumped on board, as Lotus joined Chevrolet and Honda. However, Lotus found itself at both a monetary and testing disadvantage, and it showed in the results. The disparity was most apparent in the Indy 500, where the 2 Lotus cars in the race were so slow that they were actually black flagged. Only one of the 4 teams that started with Lotus would finish the year with Lotus, and they would leave the sport in shame. In 2019, Fernando Alonso returned to make his second attempt at the Indy 500, this time with his former F1 team, McLaren. However, unlike his 2017 attempt, Alonso struggled to make good speed during practice. His week went so poorly that despite his team's pedigree and best efforts to get the car faster, Alonso was forced to make a run during bump day. Of the first 5 cars who ran on bump day, Alonso was 3rd fastest, making him the bubble driver. All that remained was an unsponsored team and a rookie named Kyle Kaiser.
Yard of bricks, Kyle Kaiser, has he knocked Alonso out? He has! Oh! Kyle Kaiser and Juncos Racing are in the Indy 500! Alonso's out!
It remains as one of the biggest bump day moments ever. When IMS was made in 1909, the Speedway was originally made entirely of bricks, hence leading to the nickname, the Brickyard. Over the next few decades, the bricks were paved over with asphalt until 1938, and the sole remnant of the original pavement is the line of bricks at the start-finish line. Turn 1 is considered by drivers to be the most difficult turn at IMS. The biggest reason is the grandstands. Unlike turns 2, 3, and 4, Turn 1 has grandstands on both sides heading toward the turn. This in turn creates a tunnel effect, making the entrance much harder to nail. Even now, when drivers enter the turn wide open at around 240 miles per hour, it remains one of the most daunting challenges for drivers. During the 2023 Indy 500, on lap 185, Felix Rosenqvist would spin after hitting the wall out of turn 3. As he spun, he hit Kyle Kirkwood, causing the left rear tire of Kirkwood's car to get dislodged and fly into the parking lot. The tire landed on a 2023 Chevy Cruze, nicknamed Snowball by the owner, Robin Matthews. Following this accident, IMS President Doug Bowles gave Matthews a 2023 Chevy Equinox, which she kept and named Snowball 2. Season 14 of The Mythbusters saw Adam Savage and Jamie Heineman do an IndyCar episode. The duo tackled several questions, such as, can man beat machine in a 30-feet standing start sprint? No. Can a driver lose 10 pounds during a race? Yes. Can a race tire's suction rip loose a manhole cover during a street race? No. Well, at least not until F1 did it. The gurney flap is a small lid on the edge of the rear wing of an Indy car. Introduced by the legendary driver Dan Gurney, this flap served the function that spoilers served for stock cars, as it simultaneously reduced drag and increased downforce, resulting in mass reduction in lap times when it was first introduced for Gurney's team, All-American Racers. This innovation has become a staple of modern Indy cars. Colton Herta is the youngest winner in IndyCar history, having won the 2019 IndyCar Classic at Circuit of the Americas at 18 years old, 11 months, and 25 days.
This second-generation driver now becomes the youngest to ever win in IndyCar. Colton Herta has done it.
Way to go.
Louis Unser is the oldest winner in IndyCar history, having won the 1953 Pikes Peak International Hill Climb at 57 years, 5 months, and 22 days. In 2019, days before the NASCAR race in the Charlotte Roval, Joseph Newgarden, who had just won his second IndyCar title, had the chance to do a brief test in his IndyCar at the track. He ran for 6 laps, and the footage can be found on his YouTube channel. As mentioned before with the double duty entry in episode 1, several NASCAR drivers have driven an IndyCar. In addition to drivers previously mentioned, such as Tony Stewart and Kurt Busch, other drivers, such as AJ Allmendinger, Bobby Allison, and Donnie Allison, also attempted the Indy 500. 3-time NASCAR champion Cale Yarborough took it even further, as he attempted the entire season in 1971, with a best finish of 5th at Trenton and Michigan. While AJ Allmendinger was technically an IndyCar driver before going to NASCAR, his brief stint in Champ Car, particularly his 2006 season, is also very noteworthy.
Watch the drag race. Allmendinger. He's going to come to the checkers. AJ Allmendinger will win his 4th race of 2006. Allmendinger is your winner.
Formula One drivers have also tried their hand at IndyCar, albeit much more often than NASCAR drivers. Several F1 drivers attempted the Indy 500 in the 60s, with Jim Clark and Graham Hill winning it. From the 80s onwards, the 80s onward had many more Formula One drivers switching to IndyCar. The 80s had Teo Fabi and Emerson Fittipaldi. The 90s had Nigel Mansell, Eddie Cheever, Alex Zanardi, Eliseo Salazar, and Roberto Moreno. The 2000s had Justin Wilson, and the 2010s and 2020s had by far the most, with drivers such as Rubens Barrichello, Takuma Sato, Alexander Rossi, Marcus Ericsson, and Romain Grosjean, as well as a slew of junior drivers such as Teo Porcher, Callum Ilott, and Christian Lundgaard. 1993 was shaping to be a bad year for Ayrton Senna, as McLaren had parted ways with Honda, and Ford was not shaping to be as competitive an engine supplier. Consequently, Senna arranged a test with Team Penske at Firebird Motorsports Park near Phoenix in late 1992. Senna would run laps that were just 7/10 off of veteran Emerson Fittipaldi. While Senna would not pursue IndyCar, news of the test was highly publicized, and it aided Senna in securing a cushy contract for 1993. The Race of Two Worlds was a combination IndyCar F1 event run in 1957 and 1958. The race would be a 500-mile event on the Monza Oval, which at the time was part of the configuration used for F1 races. While several IndyCar drivers were eager to run the race, Formula One drivers were less so, as they believed a 500-mile race at Monza to be too unsafe. The first running had only 2 F1 drivers and teams attempt the race, with both F1 teams withdrawing before the race even started. The second running would attract more European competitors, with Ferrari having 3 cars in the race. Despite a decent number of European drivers in both runnings, as sports car teams had also joined in the race, IndyCar drivers won both times. Following the 1958 race, the event was cancelled, and the oval would eventually become unused after 1969. IndyCar has been featured in several movies over the past several decades. Unfortunately, there have only been 2 IndyCar movies to come out this century: the DreamWorks movie Turbo and the unmitigated dumpster fire that was Driven. During the 1995 Indy 500, Jacques Villeneuve would unknowingly pick up the race lead on lap 38 under caution, and in the confusion pass the pace car. Villeneuve would be penalized by having 2 laps subtracted from his total, essentially putting him 2 laps down without actually being parked on pit lane. Villeneuve would race his way back onto the lead lap, and when race leader Scott Goodyear was black flagged with 6 laps to go, Villeneuve would inherit the lead and eventually win the race. Due to the nature of Villeneuve's penalty, he actually ran 102 laps, making it the Indy 505. The 1976 Indy 500 would see a caution come out on lap 100 due to a drizzle starting at the track. The cars would roll around under caution until lap 103, when a red flag was dropped due to the rain falling harder. Over the course of the day, the IMS crew kept trying to dry the track to get the race restarted. Making this complicated was the rain, which would intermittently pick up and let up. By 3:15 p.m., the rain was coming in hard, and USAC would make the decision to end the race at 102 laps completed, or 255 miles. This premature ending to the Indy 500 would give Johnny Rutherford his second Indy 500 win. Janet Guthrie was the first woman to race in the Indy 500. She would first qualify for the 500 in 1977 and race 2 more times in the race in 1978 and 1979, with the best finish of 9th in 1978. Willie T. Ribbs was the first African-American driver to race in the Indy 500. During his attempt in 1991, Ribbs faced challenges all month, as he faced engine failures in practice, as well as a broken valve, a broken turbocharger, and a broken scavenger pump in qualifying. With less than an hour to go on bump day, after shaking down the car a few hours prior, Ribbs would finally put together a qualifying effort to bump his way into 29th place. He would finish in 32nd.
Ribbs down, nothing can go wrong now. He can coast into Indy 500 history. The checkered flag falls, Ribbs has made it.
Rajo Jack, aka Dewey Gatson, was one of the first prominent African Americans in racing. His career began during the early to mid 1900s, when segregation was still prominent in sports. Thus, in addition to lying about his ancestry, Gatson adopted the moniker of Rajo Jack to sneak his way into races. Rajo Jack would build a reputation as one of the best drivers on the West Coast, as he could win in any number of vehicles, whether it was a stock car, a sprint car, or even a motorcycle. Rajo Jack would retire from full-time racing in 1947 and retire completely in 1954. His legacy lives on in Force Indy, which carries one of Rajo Jack's most used car numbers with the goal of elevating African-American talent. Corey Witherell was the first Native American to race in the Indy 500. Witherell, who spent most of his IndyCar career in Indy Lights, would run 2 races in 2001, including the 500. Witherell would start 31st and finish 19th. Well, that was fun. We saw a lot more of the sport's history today, including legendary mechanics, beloved broadcasters and team owners, and renowned trailblazers. You won't want to miss the next episode, as that's where the stories really start to get interesting. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, this is Bowser Jr. XD signing off. Have a good one.